All right. So for those of you who are not able to join us tonight, first of all, we miss you. And we wanted to make sure that you had an opportunity to be part of the group and make a project that I'm calling a 2-for-1, because we're going to do one stamping technique and build the background for the card that you see on the left. And then at the same time, we are building the 3 pieces that are the focal point for the card on the right. And the products that I'm focusing on in this include the Quiet Meadow stamp set and the corresponding Meadow dies. And these Meadow dies are probably really the shining star of the cards. And you'll see why in a couple minutes, but there are quite a few dies that come with this set, and they are truly incredible. And I think you'll see that as we go through. Literally going to jump into this because it is so much easier to explain it if I just do it. And the way that I start is I'm going to start by creating the background for the card on the left. And that is going to be done on a piece of basic white. It is a regular old A2 card. So it's 8.5 by 5.5, scored at 4 1/4 and folded. So nothing magical or mystical about that. And then what I'm going to do is I have die cut 3 of the images from the Meadow Dies collection. And I have purposely cut these in white, in basic white. You could actually cut these in a different color if you wanted to, because they will be what will go on the second card. They will end up being used on this particular card. And you're going to notice that the dies that I chose are ones that stand alone. You don't have to stamp an image and cut this out to know what these images are. It's really very clear that they're foliage. And I would just suggest for something like what we're going to be doing, that you think about using dies that people know what you are trying to show, what the shape conveys, what it actually is, without having to see a stamped image on it. I cut these out, and then what I did is I wanted to create a tacky back. And I'm using an old product. I apologize for that. It's a 2-way glue pen, and Stampin' Up! Used to sell these. There are also some that are on the market in other brands. And what this does is it acts 2 different ways as a glue. If you put it on whatever you are adding the glue to and immediately put that piece down onto a piece of paper, it will act like a glue. It will hold it as a permanent adhesion. If you put the glue on and you let it dry, it becomes tacky. It's like a Post-it note. And that's what I'm going for here, because I want these to act like a mask. I want them to be a buffer so that the ink that I'm going to put on the top does not go through, and we're left with a silhouette that is on the card. There are other ways that you can do this. You don't need 2-way glue. You can use other adhesives and just let it dry, let the adhesive dry a little bit before you actually put it down, and it should get kind of tacky. You're going to see that this is adhering. It's not going to stick. I will have the ability to pull that off if I want to. And I'm just arranging these 3 pieces on my card. And I'm doing a couple things when I'm putting these down. One is I am making sure that when I put these images down, that I like how they are placed on the card, because they are going to end up being the background for the design. So I want to make sure that I'm at least okay with where the foliage is, and that it looks good enough that I'll be happy with it when I pull this up and I'm done. The other thing that I'm doing is I'm trying to keep each of these three pieces from not overlapping each other. And the reason is when I make that second card, if I don't overlap, each of these individual pieces is going to be fully colored. There won't be any place where there's a blank. You know, if I had overlapped maybe this leaf onto the stem over here, then I wouldn't get any color on the stem. And I definitely want to make sure that I get everything colored. And once I have those pieces on my card, I'm just going to turn this over and I'm going to give it just a little bit of a burnish. I want to see if I can sort of get any places that are popping up to be a little bit more cooperative. If not, it's not a big deal. There are other things that you can use too to get this to be sticky. If you wanted to use some glue dots, you can do that. You would need to get some of the adhesion off the glue dots so they don't really stick to your paper too badly. The next step is going to be ink blending. And you will notice if I bring the finished card back in that I used 3 colors. The 3 colors that I used are in colors. They're not from the most current in colors. They're from the ones that were introduced last year. They are Magenta Madness, Bumblebee, and Misty Moonlight. When I do 3 colors like this and I'm ink blending, I do try, don't always succeed, but I do try to use colors that will look okay when the colors are blended together. And I tend to go as simply as I can. I know that the primary colors are going to work, and I get as close to the primary colors as I can to do this. I'm not using a red, pink is close. I'm not using a real yellow, Bumblebee is close. Night blue is definitely, a Misty Moonlight, excuse me, is definitely a blue. So if I use these 3 and I do blending, the pink and the yellow, they're going to do okay. The yellow and the blue, they're going to do okay. So just be sure to make sure that the colors that you use when you blend the 2 that are going to be right next to together, that they don't create a muddy mess. And you can actually test that before you get into a lot of the ink blending. And I am going to just open up my pads here, but I wanted to talk for just a second about the Stampin' Up! Blending brushes. I have used other brushes that are on the market, and I decided that I wanted to try the ones from Stampin' Up! And they come 3 in a package. I think they're something like $12. I could be wrong. And if I compare them to, just going to bring one out, something that I've used before that's on the market, they are denser. They definitely have more bristles than the ones that I typically used. I like the Stampin' Up! Ones. They're also very easy to clean. They don't need a lot of soap. If you run them under water, they clean very well. And they also dry pretty quickly, which is really nice. So that if you're doing a project and you want to get things refreshed and you want to do something else, then you just run them under water, put them aside, and they dry pretty well. So I do like them, and I think they're a good value for the money. What I have done is I have put some ink from each of the 3 colors onto a block. And we've done this in the past where using a block is kind of handy because we're not going to be going back into an ink pad, and we're not going to pollute the ink that is on that ink pad. We're not going to mix colors. I am making sure that I have a brush for each of the colors because I don't want to get them mixed up right now. And I am going to start with the pink. I'm going to just turn this upside down just because I'm going to go pink, yellow, and blue. And I'm going to grab a little bit of that ink. You put it on a block and you put it on one side of the block. The other side is a great little palette that you can use to get the ink onto your brush and just make sure that things are working the way you want. Just rub it off a little bit before you go onto the paper. That will give you a good feel of what the intensity is, and also it will allow that ink to kind of blend into the bristles a little bit more. And you don't need to think a lot. The ink blending is definitely one of those things that you don't overthink it, you just kind of do it. And what I want is I want to get most of the card, not necessarily all the way to the edge, because it will look kind of cool if I leave some of the edges a little bit lighter. And I can come back if I want to put some more kind of pink in there. And I'm just getting this a little saturated. And I am making sure that I'm covering that die cut. I want to get that nice and inked up. It is going to get inked with a couple more layers, but it's good to just get it sort of, I don't know, maybe primed is a good word, to take on more of the ink color. You can also reverse the way that you are using the brushes to get a little bit more of the ink off. And I'm just going to work a little bit more of this on. And then I'm going to move to the yellow. And I'm really also on this side that is going to be the pink. I'm trying to get a little bit darker pink over there. And then I'll start blending the bumblebee a little bit more in the middle. I may come back to that. But now I'm going to switch over to the bumblebee. And I can turn my card right side up. And I grab some of that bumblebee and do the same thing. Go off the page a little bit. Come in, and the more ink that I put on these brushes, the more easily that ink is going to go onto the paper. It's just like when you're painting a wall or anything else, you need to convince the project that it needs to have the color. And you're going to notice that where those two colors are coming together, we're kind of getting this fun little tangerine-y, orange-ish that is just pretty. It's not a muddy color. If you blend some colors together and you really don't make sure that they work, you may end up with a muddy mess. So just be aware of them and just take a little bit of time beforehand. You can grab a piece of paper and kind of see how they're going to work before you commit to putting them onto your card. As I'm working this, because I'm moving bristles over the die cut pieces, sometimes they're going to pop up a little bit just because I'm probably going underneath some of those smaller pieces. That's fine. I'm just going to pause if I see something that is popping up, and I'm just going to reset that and push it back down. And again, I may come back in a second and fill that in a little bit more. But I'm going to move on to my Misty Moonlight. Get some of that. This is definitely dark, and that's fine. You want to be able to see the differences in the color. And I definitely want to make sure that little flower is down. But I'm just going through and adding in my blue. And where the blue and the yellow are meeting, there's a fun little green that's sort of happening. So I know those two colors are working together well. And then just continuing to work this, change the direction every once in a while. And I am not overthinking to the point of trying to get the same saturation of color for my blue in different areas. If the blue is darker at one point and lighter in another, I'm happy. It's fine. Make sure that's sticking down. That one was popping up a little bit. I'm just going to continue to work that. And I'm just going to go through, and there are a couple spaces that are a little bit too white. I want to make sure that I get a little more color toward the edge of the card. So I'm going to go back in and just add a little bit more. We're going to be putting a couple more layers of ink on the top, so I don't need to overwork this. And what's really fun for me is as I'm doing this, I'm realizing that this work is going to create two cards. So it is fun to do. And the fact that we're going to get a 2-for-1 out of it is really cool. I'm just going to grab my yellow, put a little bit more up at the top, maybe a little bit more yellow down at the bottom just to bring out that color. I'm just about done with the ink blending. Go back over here. I'm going to turn this just so, being right-handed, I want to make sure that I can control the ink a little bit by coming in from the right. Okay, and I think I'm pretty happy with that. So I'm just going to pause here and take a look. And yeah, I'm good with that because again, we're going to be adding some more color. Now I'm going to push my blocks off to the side. What is really nice about putting the ink on the blocks is I can go back and I can use the ink later. If the ink dries on the blocks, all I need to do is spritz the block a little bit with water and I will reactivate that ink and I can use it just like I did. So I'm not wasting anything. So let me bring in the finished card, and each one is going to look different, obviously. So what we've done is that first layer, the pink, the yellow, and the blue. Well, now we're going to layer some other stamps on the top. Before we take the die cuts off, we're going to finish the stamping. And we are actually going to stamp 2 images from the Quiet Meadow stamp set onto this card. First one I'm going to do is the fun one that has random words. If you read it, it definitely includes words that theoretically make a sentence or make a saying. And I lied to you, we're going to do 3. We're also going to do a flower, and we are also going to do grungy dots. And you know me, and you know how much I absolutely love, love, love grungy dots. So we're going to be adding these 3, and we are going to be using 3 different colors to do this. The first one I'm going to do is the one with the words. And to do that, I'm going to use, again, one of the in colors. This is from last year. This is Cinnamon Cider. What is nice about what we're going to do here is it's meant to be random. There's not, you don't need to be perfect. I think this is, to me, kind of a classic shabby chic sort of card, and perfection is definitely not what we're going for. So what I'm going to do, I've got my block, I've got my ink, and I am making sure that the stamp set is facing up, so the lettering is facing up. And I'm going to stamp this so it looks like there are kind of rows of the letters in the background. And I'm going to go directly over the die cuts. So I'm just going to pull this down just a tad. And a couple of things. When you do this and you have die cuts, give it a good push. You don't need to go completely crazy. Just give it a good push, and always go back and re-stamp your image after you have stamped it down. The reason is because you've got a die cut and you're going off the page, you are going to have ink on parts of your stamp and not on other parts of your stamp. And if you go back in and you don't re-ink, you will have different intensities of the stamp. And I'll show you what I mean in just a second. But you're going to notice that this stamp is not wide enough to go across the entire card. That's fine. All I'm going to do is, what you're seeing here is build a little kind of stacking of the letters. And I'm not even worried if I'm getting everything straight. If I have the same angle, it is absolutely irrelevant. So just adding that. And what's fun is that these letters are also getting stamped onto the flowers, the dies. I'm going to go back in and kind of fill in the gaps. Again, not trying to be absolutely perfect. And then I'm going to go back in and fill in, oops, I missed the top one. Go back in a minute, fill in the other side. And again, I do not care that there's more space here than there is down at the bottom. That's not what I'm going for. And just stamp that. Stamp that. And then fill it right in at the bottom. So I've got my word background. Now what I want to do is add a couple more images. And I'm going to use a couple different colors. The other images that I chose to add, you can see there's the flower, which is this stamp. And also the dots. I'm going to get that onto a block as well. And the dots will fit onto a D block if you put it at an angle like that. So you don't need to have it straight because we're going to be just randomly stamping. So let's do the flower first. And I'm bringing back in my blue. Now, I decided that I wanted the flower that I'm going to be stamping onto the front not to be the full intensity of this blue. Let me show you how dark this is. It's really dark. I want it to be second generation. So I am going to get ink on my stamp, and before I put it onto the card, I'm just going to stamp it off on my scrap, and then I will stamp onto my card. It's still dark, but it's nowhere near as dark as it would have been had I done first generation. And I am purposely going to stamp this flower in and around where the dies are. I know that it's not going to be a great image because there are a lot of thicknesses that are going on here. But I'm just going to give it as good a push as I can. And I'm saying I'm happy. That's fine. Good enough. We'll try another one kind of down here. And I'm just trying to remember that I have want to stamp off before I put this down so I don't get it too dark. And I'll do one more maybe. I'll do it right there. And I'm going to just, because I want to, kind of do one off the page at the bottom. So I've got this fun little flower thing going on right now. And again, remember, we're creating the basis for 2 cards while we're doing this. Our last stamp is going to be the fun dots. And I'm using the last of the 5 in colors. So this is using all 5 in colors from the 20 to 22. And this is just jade. This is one of my absolutely all-time favorite grains. I love this. It is just so pretty. And this one, I am going to go in full strength. it could be fun to do full strength and second generation on this too, if you wanted to. And again, don't overthink it, go for it. Just have some fun and add some dots. We're thinking shabby chic here, so you can just put it wherever you want. Change the orientation of your stamp occasionally when you're doing this, so you don't have everything looking like it's going in the same direction. You also don't need to use the entire stamp. You can use parts of it on the edge just to give a little bit of interest here and there. And I'm getting close to being done with this. I don't want to overdo. So I think I'm okay. So that's our stamping. I'm going to let that sit for 2 seconds while we talk about the sentiment, because while this just sits for a second, everything is going to dry very quickly. We can look at what the sentiment was that I decided to use for this. And it also comes from the Quiet Meadow stamp set. It's You're Too Kind. These are some really nice sentiments, very useful. And it looks kind of shabby chic to me when I stamped it. I used the brown cinnamon cider, so the same ink that I used on the background for the letters, I ended up using for the sentiment. And I stamped that onto some basic white. And I cut that out with one of the dies from the Meadow dies. And then I also cut out a little piece of cinnamon cider cardstock. And I put that behind the sentiment because I wanted to sort of get that cinnamon cider going a little bit throughout. And ended up putting some gold twine around the piece I put in the background. And then I've added some elements at the end. But now, this is the part that's fun. Not that what we've been doing hasn't been fun. This should be nice and dry. And what we're going to do, or what I'm going to do, is peel these off. And I'm going to start down at the bottom. It's a little bit easier to get to. And I'm being gentle, I'm just pulling this off because I have that two-way glue on the bottom. I'm just giving it a little bit of a tug, and it's coming right off. It's popping right off. And you're going to be left with a really fun white silhouette underneath. So we've got that one that just came off, and we're left with that white silhouette. I'm going to flip this to a different solid color so I can show you what these look like. This is going to be part of the second card. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to use the pieces that we're taking off. I'm going to peel off that middle one. I say I'm going to peel off the middle one. Come on, middle one. There we go. This is, I don't know why, this is just fun. It's like you're revealing a present or something. So I'm just going to peel that right off. And now we have the area where this little guy had been. And this is so cool because the pieces that I'm taking off have the ink blending color as their base. Then they have the stamps that we used to go back over and add a little bit of dimension, you know, layered on top. And they look like they were maybe designer series paper, or, you know, that it took you an awful lot of time and effort to create something like that. And it's really pretty simple. So I'm just peeling this last one off. And now I have elements for 2 cards. So for this card, let me grab these out of the way for just 2 seconds here. For the card that we just created on the left, you're going to see that, you know, obviously there are some similarities, but there are a lot of differences as well. And I'm not going to do those. I'm just going to tell you what I did. We've kind of already talked about this. I cut a piece of that cinnamon cider. I've got my sentiment. I used some gold twine. This is not Stampin' Up. I did 3 turns on the cinnamon cider piece. I tied a bow in the same gold twine, and I attached that to the top. And then I used some bling. These are the genial gems and the opal rounds. And I use these because they both have gold hints. They've got little sort of speckles of gold in the middle, and they really pulled out the gold. And I added those, made sure I had 5. So you can see 2 up here, 2 here, and 1 kind of tucked down under there. And everything is layered, so it goes on with dimensionals. And just put that together. So the finishing touches are very straightforward. The part that I really wanted to show you is how to create the background. Now let's talk about the other parts. Here's what we also created. These really fun pieces. And it's really cool. I mean, if you look at these, if you go between the pink and the yellow, you can see a really funky orange. And then over in here between the yellow and the blue, you see this really funky green. And it's like a puzzle. Your brain sort of looks between them to think, you know, were they created in the same piece? How in the world was that done? And one way to finish this off is to put it together maybe something like this. And what that would be is, I started with a piece of crumb cake cardstock. Again, it's A2, so it's 8.5, 5.5, scored at 4 1/4, regular old A2 card. And then I didn't want to leave the background only as crumb cake. I wanted to do a couple things. I really like the cinnamon cider color. It's just super pretty. So I decided that I wanted the frame in the background to be cinnamon cider. And I cut that out. And then I also wanted to pull back in the crumb cake. But you'll notice that on this piece, I put it through an embossing folder. It's the Tasteful Textile, and it is really pretty. Now, you could do a bunch of things here. You could add maybe a touch of the cinnamon cider on a blending brush just to give it a little bit more texture. You could bring in some Versamark and go back and maybe stamp some of the letters because they would show kind of fun in the background. You can do a lot of things on this if you want to. So I did the cinnamon cider background as the frame. And then I've got my 3 pieces that I'm going to put on the top. And one thing is really fun now. I've got the freedom to arrange these flowers or the foliage however I want. I can overlap the stems. I could cut the stems off and make them shorter if I wanted to do that. You can orient it as a landscape card if you want to do that and completely change the size of these particular flowers. You can also overhang the flowers, so you're not bound to just that inner piece of crumb cake. And you'll see here that I purposely put this piece and this piece so that they're over the side. I wanted to make sure that there was some interest on the side as well. And I figured out where I wanted the pieces to go. And what will now happen is if you have put two-way glue or anything that is creating the tackiness is not going to hold your pieces to your card. So when you have your pieces in place and you know where you want them to be, so let's say I wanted everything, just arrange these kind of random over here. And I do want the stems to cross a little bit. So maybe this is the orientation that I want for this piece. What I would do, and what I did on this card, is I would get some glue. And I would actually hold these pieces on at the bottom. And I would lift one at a time. It's still going to be tacky, so you're still going to have to lift these. So if you lift it up and you put some glue on the back, and I use Tombow for this, then you're going to have the ability to really get this adhered where you want it to be. And by holding the bottom down, the orientation of where you're setting your dies will stay. And then once you have the bottoms done, you can turn this around and you can pull the stems up. You can put a little bit of glue on the back of the stems and actually put those down as well. And that's just a nice way. You don't have to pick everything up and try to remember exactly where you had it on your card, because unless you take a picture, which you can, you will never get it exactly the way you had it. And that way, once you've got it down, I would be able to go in right now and I could literally just glue these and they would be exactly where I wanted them to be. And then for finishing, I didn't want to do an awful lot to this. I thought it was kind of busy and interesting enough with the different colors and the different designs that are on the die cuts, but it needed a little something, something. And again, going back to the Quiet Meadow stamp set, there's some fun sentiments, and there's this really cute little one, Love. And it pairs with one of the dies that is in the Meadow Dies collection. It's this cute little tag. And I stamped Love on a piece of basic white. I used the cinnamon cider ink, cut that out with the die that I just showed you. I cut out one more tag with that same die. And I thought it would be kind of fun to put a cinnamon cider tag behind that white tag, just to give it a little more something, something. So I glued those two together so they wouldn't move once I figured out how I wanted them to sit. Put a little bit of Tombow, and you can do this in so many different ways. You can offset it a little bit or a lot. It's really whatever makes you happy. And then I wanted to have some twine to do a little bit of fun on that particular sentiment. So I have some twine here. And what I decided to do, this is something I always do. When you have twine like this and it is stored on one of these little spools, inevitably it's super curly when you take it off. If you run it through your fingernail and on your thumb and your first finger, and you just do that a couple times, you will get most of the curl out. And it's much, much better to work with when that curl is gone. So I just took a piece of twine, I doubled it, and where I looped it, I put that loop underneath, brought it through, cut my twine, so I just have one piece, and then I pulled the tails through, So I have a cute little sentiment like that. And then I just tied a bow. And typically I use a bow maker to tie my bows, but this is such a simple bow. It really is not a big deal. So I just tied my bow and decided how big I wanted the loops to be. And got them as big as I wanted. I didn't want really big ones. And then to make sure that this is not going to untie, I knotted the pieces that are hanging. And I just tied a little knot in those and brought it up to the bottom of my bow. And gave that a nice little pull. And that way I know that it's not going to come untied. And for this particular card, I just glued the sentiment directly onto the front. I didn't want a lot of layering. I wanted this one to be pretty simple. So I glued that sentiment directly onto the front of the card. And then again, I decided that we needed a little bling and went back to the same bling that I had used on the other ones, the opal rounds and the genial gems, and did some random ones. I ended up with 5 on here as well. And I like when the gems are ones that you have to look for. You know, it's not completely obvious where they are. And I also like using the odd numbers. So that is how these cards were made. And I hope that you liked the technique that we used to do this and the ability to use the 3 die cuts on another card and just the fun. These are shabby chic to me. I think they're just super pretty, super fun, super interesting, and they kind of stand on their own. So that's it. And again, it's using the Quiet Meadow